Recording. There we go. I think we're ready to get started. So I am happy to welcome you to the Corner Society. And I'm Hal Raz. I'm together with Mr. Bob Riley. We coordinate this. Thank you for coming out. And it's a great pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Dr. Laura Hirschbein, who came out from Michigan to speak to us. Dr. Hirschbein is a psychiatrist and historian at the University of Michigan. She's one of the few unique clinician historians who practice what she researches and manage to combine being a clinician and a practicing historian, and also a leader and a mentor to many people in our relatively small field. She has published 2 books, American Melancholy, Constructions of Depression in the 20th Century, and Smoking Privileges, Psychiatry, the Mentally Ill, and the Tobacco Industry, which brings together things that you wouldn't necessarily think about at the same time for a really interesting analysis. Her book today, both of them with Rutgers University Press. Her talk today is part of a larger project on the history of child psychiatry, which is funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and will have, I think, have clear policy implications as well. And I'm delighted that she's here to share her new and exciting work with us. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Hirschbein to the Corner Society.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. And in full disclosure, the cheap excuse to come visit my son, who's a senior at Eastman, just down the road. So I got to spend today doing a time-honored tradition of ferrying him back and forth, getting to talk to him as I acted as his chauffeur. So it was a real treat for me as a mom. So that brings to this topic today: depressed moms and troubled sons. So as Dr. Raz mentioned, one of my earlier works was in the history of depression. And so today I'm going to be taking some of that work and putting it together with some new work on the history of child psychiatry. In the tradition of medical talks, I will disclose that I have no conflicts of interest, no relationships with commercial entities, past, present, or future. But I am going to be talking about some drugs by name in a very critical way. So there's, just so that we're all clear, there's nothing to disclose. This is also very much a work in progress, so I welcome lots of conversation, lots of questions, because this is an enormously rich topic, and as many of you know, the time period of trying to understand what's going on with mental health with adults and kids is so complex, and there's so many different pieces that putting it all together and trying to extract some kind of coherent narrative that moves over time is sometimes a challenge. So if I've missed some enormous pieces of the puzzle, please tell me. I may or may not have realized that I missed it. So, this is, again, a work in progress. So in 1972, Myrna Weissman, Yale researcher who was finishing up her dissertation in psychiatric epidemiology, published this article in Casework, I believe it's Casework, Social Casework, in which she talked about the implications of depression in mothers on their kids. And she particularly talked about the effects of maternal depression on teenagers who could act out sexually, be rebellious, be sullen, have all kinds of difficulties because their mothers were depressed. And that if you treated their mothers, the kids would get better. And so at the time that Weissman was writing about this, there was lots of emerging conversation about depression, particularly in women. And interestingly enough, almost no discussion about depression in kids. The party line among child psychiatrists of the time was that depression didn't really happen in kids, maybe in older teenagers, but in general, there was a lot of agreement among many people, with some dissenting folks, but there was a lot of agreement that depression was not something that child psychiatrists had to worry about. This is a problem for adults. And so Weissman's approach, again, focusing on moms and focusing on the health of moms, fit within what was going on in adult psychiatry at the time, and also with child psychiatry, that if we're going to talk about mood stuff, it's going to be in the context of the mother. At the time that Weissman was doing her work, adult psychiatry had been facing a crisis, and many people have written about this. Adult psychiatry was trying to extricate itself from the years of psychoanalysis, but also the problems of the state psychiatric hospitals that were causing all kinds of problems So a small and growing number of psychiatrists started to talk about what they were calling the new biological psychiatry, diagnosis and medications, or in many cases, medications and then diagnoses. And the paradigmatic diagnosis that really helped the field grow was depression. As Temple University chair of psychiatry, Jonathan Cole, noted, from the psychiatrist's point of view, depression is an exceedingly satisfactory disease. Sorry, I don't have my reading glasses on. So depression was satisfactory. It was something that actually responded to treatment. So psychiatrists were very, very excited about this new, and it really was in many ways new. Lots of people have written about the continuities that depression as an illness extends back millennia. You can find ancient reports of it. That is all very true. However, this idea of a particular diagnosis with particular features that you could diagnose and that you could more effectively treat with medications that patients would come into shorter term general hospitals, psychiatric units of general hospitals, get treated and then go home, was something that was relatively new. And the diagnosis of depression that we now know as major depressive disorder didn't actually emerge. It was in sort of draft form in the early 1970s, but didn't emerge in finalized form until DSM-3 in 1980. So for adult psychiatrists, depression was really a way of kind of reconceptualizing their field. But for child psychiatry, there was nothing comparable. In fact, child psychiatrists didn't like to talk about diagnoses in kids. They were worried that diagnoses would follow kids around and label them for long periods of time. There was lots of concern about kids. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there were concerns about kids acting out, doing all kinds of things, but the idea of a specific diagnosis for kids was not something that was very often talked about. And child psychiatry was in a very different place with regard to things like medication. So the worldview in which depression became dominant within adult psychiatry was not something that was very common in kids. So I want to talk very briefly about medication and the emergence of depression in adults, because it was particularly around the topic of women. The part of the emerging conversation about depression and its dominance in women came about not, it is a commonplace now that depression is twice as common in women as it is in men. What I've written about and what others have written about is that that was not something that was like discovered in the wild and then sort of treated. That reality was partly shaped by the realities of psychiatric hospitals at the time that new drugs were introduced to treat mental illness. Even before there was a specific category that we could call antidepressants or antipsychotics, medications were given to people in hospitals and then sort of sorted out what they did after the fact. And what's particularly interesting about medications for mental illness in adults, in the second half of the 20th century and through into the 21st century, is how many drug trials were dominated by women. Most of us have the assumption, and certainly this is something that's been discussed at the NIH level, that med trials were not done in women because of the worry about reproductive risk. And NIH and FDA made it explicit in 1977 that drug trials shouldn't be done in women of childbearing potential because of the risk toward the fetus. But that has never been true for psychiatric medications. And this was the numbers that I'm showing here are pre-1970, but going into the 80s, 90s, and beyond, drug trials involving things that we now associate with antidepressant were being done in women. So I'm showing this partly to show that the samples, the numbers of people who were studied in depression research and what emerged in depression research was really dominating in women, that was most of the conversation. The conversation was, in fact, so dominated by women that Myrna Weissman, who wrote a book called The Depressed Woman, a lot of her studies were only about women, and she published papers that had depression in the title and the abstract without mentioning that it was only talking about women. It was like depression is women, and women get depressed. What's particularly fascinating about Weissman is that, at least for her, she didn't see this as like a medicalization in a negative sort of way. She saw the idea of women suffering from depression as a feminist issue. So she worked as a social worker in the late 50s into the 60s, then went to work at Yale, where she was working as a social worker in the Department of Psychiatry while she tried to raise 4 young children, only working a couple of days a week. And then wound up getting her PhD in epidemiology and doing a lot of the foundational research around something called interpersonal psychotherapy, IPT. She essentially wrote the manual for that. And so for her, she saw depression as a feminist issue, and that she saw that women were really struggling in the 70s. They were facing all kinds of social, economic obstacles, and that they were having a hard time and they would get depressed. She wasn't necessarily seeing depression as the reason they weren't succeeding. She was seeing depression as the ultimate endpoint of the struggles that they were facing. And although she partnered with Gerald Clerman, who was another researcher at Yale, and ultimately married him on divorce of her first husband, she was invested in the idea of medication, but really focused more on therapy. Weissman saw the possibilities of therapy helping women, and she even presented in 1975 the possibility that consciousness raising groups to help women learn skills would be a way out of their depression, that it wasn't just an illness that needed to be treated. So she took it relatively broadly, and she was concerned about functioning. And one of her big things was functioning as a mom. And again, she had 4 kids, not surprising that would be on her mind. And so that depression in kids from depressed moms is something that recurs throughout the story. Okay. So a lot of this conversation about depression was happening in adults, relatively little happening in kids. People like Weissman, a number of researchers at the National Institute of Mental Health, a number of researchers at places like Washington University in St. Louis and the New York State Psychiatric Institute were doing more and more trials, refining both medications and also diagnoses. And so the National Institute of Mental Health was helping to coordinate a lot of this, and really supporting quite a number of the researchers. And one of the things that they started to do was to present information to the media about disorders and helping to educate the public. And during one of their media days to talk about depression in adults, one of the reporters asked, well, what about depression in kids? And so Bertram Brown, who was the director of NIMH at the time, said, great question. We're very concerned at NIMH about kids and about kids' mental health. You know, we should look into this. And so in 1975, NIMH gathered together all of the researchers who'd been doing anything about childhood depression. There were about 6 of them, and brought them together in Bethesda to talk about what to do. And it began a conversation about depression that really highlighted, again, the differences between adults and kids in terms of how people were approaching mental health. And so I think science writers probably expected, and I would imagine that leaders in NIMH who were looking at adults would also have this expectation that if we have this illness of depression, it happens in women. In the 1970s, researchers were also starting to look at genetics, which is a whole complicated and very interesting topic in and of itself. How do you even talk about psychiatric genetics in the 60s and 70s? But even sort of looking at families, it would make some sense to expect that if we've got this illness that theoretically is an illness, it's not just kind of a problem in living, and it happens more in women than in men, and it responds to medication, then what does that mean for kids? How does that show up? Does it happen in kids? So many in child psychiatry said, no, it doesn't happen in kids. It just arises in adults. But what does it mean to start to ask those questions? And so this really kind of ran up against a number of assumptions in child psychiatry. And as I mentioned, one of them is that, we don't give drugs to kids. I'm sorry, that we don't give diagnoses to kids. The other is we don't give drugs to kids. Cindy Connolly has done a really great book on the history of child pharmacology, which is that we don't give meds to kids unless we absolutely have to, that's the new explosion of meds in kids is relatively recent. And the other thing, well, 2 other things. One was that the idea of genetics in kids was very troubled, even more so than it was for adults. So one of the big things that many in child psychiatry got into the field to look at was the idea of prevention, that we want to make sure that kids who are troubled don't turn into adults who wind up staying in state hospitals for decades. And so prevention meant biology is not destiny, that it doesn't matter what your history is, what your parentage is, all the stories about the awful IQ testing and the determinant stuff. The child psychiatrists were very anti-determinist factors by the 60s and 70s. And so this idea of depression as a genetic illness didn't set well with anybody. But one of the most concrete things that highlighted the difference between adults and kids, especially starting to look at depression, was the clinical samples. So I already showed you the numbers of women who were involved in drug trials of depression. This is what the child psychiatry clinics looked like. They were all boys. And so there were lots of conversations about the fact that they were variously called mental hygiene clinics, child guidance clinics, sometimes child psychiatry clinics. It was well known in the field that the biggest problem for kids and the reason that parents brought their kids into the clinics was acting out behaviors, and that boys predominated in that. And so most of the literature in child psychiatry really focused on these problems of acting out. And as Debbie Darashow has talked about, the emotionally disturbed child, somebody who's acting out, who's so disruptive that they can't be managed at home. And so depression in a lot of ways was entirely the opposite. It's not something that people would in child psychiatry talked about or even were thinking about. And so there's just a lot of translation, and the translation is not an even application of science. And so that's really the story of how do we define something that doesn't make sense to define, and then how do we redefine it if it still isn't making sense. So one of the big player in the conversation about the emergence of depression in kids was NIMH. And during this time period, there was actually a lot of transition at NIMH. So when the question was asked about depression in kids, Bertram Brown was the director. Brown was a social justice do-gooder, really saw NIMH as expanding the ideas of social justice. He was anti-racist, did what he could within the limits of his time to try to bring awareness of racial issues, was very invested in community mental health, and saw issues around environment and issues having to do with race and poverty as being really important to child mental health, and really was framing things as mental health. He was let go in 1977, ironically, by Jimmy Carter, who thought that the mission creep of NIMH was a little bit too much. And he was replaced at the behest of a lot of people in psychiatry who wanted psychiatry to be, again, more focused and more basic science-based, essentially. Was replaced with Herb Curtis, who helped to steer the agency toward neuroscience, and really pretty aggressively toward neuroscience. And part of what Herb Curtis had to do was to make the case that psychiatry was its own medical specialty, that it needed to have more to it than just, the environment is bad, or we need to think about the unconscious complex, that something needed to be more scientific and more concrete and more demonstrable. Actually, one of the things that Partis did that was really interesting, in 1979, he was arguing for the value of adult psychiatry, and he said that psychiatrists were the only experts in the biological, psychological, and social context in which to understand humans, echoing, whether intentionally or unintentionally, the biopsychosocial formulation that was proposed by George Engel in 1977 in Science, which I think is fun here at University of Rochester, because Engel is just so fascinating in how he pulled all of that stuff together in psychiatry. All right, so the 6 people who were working on depression at the time that NIMH gathered the researchers together, 2 of them, and I'm exaggerating a tiny bit, but it wasn't that much more than 6. 2 of the big researchers were Donald McNew and Leon Citron, who wrote a parent's manual in 1983 called Why Isn't Johnny Crying? And I think this really illustrates a bunch of different things about how they were conceptualizing depression. Again, part of what they were arguing was that, yes, depression exists, but it looks different. It's nothing like what adult psychiatry looks like. And there's a boy, and that's not a coincidence. That's, again, these are troubled kids, and the problem with the trouble is that they're depressed. They're not delinquent or anything else like that. And so in this book and in their work, McNew and Citrin classified depressive types in kids as there are three basic kinds that they said. There was masked depressive reaction of childhood that involved aggressive or delinquent behaviors. There was acute depressive reaction following a traumatic event, and chronic depressive reaction. And so basically the kids who everybody said were acting out, they said actually at least some of them were really depressed. And their model for it, they're sort of like how they thought of this, was particularly the loss of a major figure in a child's life, particularly the mother. And again, sort of thinking about the biography of the particular people involved, it's not a huge surprise that Leon Citrin had lost his mother in a particularly traumatic way. Citrin was a Holocaust survivor, and his mother and sister were killed, I think, in Auschwitz, and he survived. So that this loss of a mother echoed throughout all of their writing. But McNew and Citrin and a lot of their followers really focused on this mass depression idea, this idea that depression in kids looked nothing like what it did in adults. And there were all these symptoms that had nothing to do with what you might think of as depression. And it required some detective work to unmask it. This was particularly in contrast to DSM-3, which came out in 1980. And so one of the many interesting things about diagnoses and their evolution in kids, and this is something that I've been trying to get my hands around for the bigger project involving child mental illness in general, that again, child psychiatrists didn't want to diagnose, and they really struggled against diagnoses. But when they finally had to deal with it, then they objected to the fact that they got left out of the adult diagnostic systems. So there were relatively few child psychiatrists who got invited to the small group that wrote DSM-3, and Bob Spitzer, who really wrote it, was not a child psychiatrist. And so he collaborated with a few, but there were, I think, 4 or 5 child psychiatrists involved. And so there was a whole section in DSM-3 that remains the disorders commonly arising in childhood or infancy. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's basically early childhood stuff involving what used to be called mental retardation, developmental delay, stuff that happens in early childhood. And then there are a whole bunch of, and then all the other diagnoses that may or may not mention anything having to do with kids. And in DSM-3, the depression description barely mentions kids. It's got the symptoms that many of us know well of depression. It hasn't really changed between DSM-3 and DSM-5. The only major difference, and it's major or minor depending on your perspective, is that there was a mood descriptor in DSM-3 that included irritability. So it could be down a low mood or irritable mood. That was for all and anybody with depression in DSM-3. The irritable descriptor got taken out for adults for DSM-3R in 1987. As far as I can tell, because Bob Spitzer thought it should not be there. I've talked to a bunch of people who were there, and that's as far as there's nothing in writing, nothing in the API archives, nothing. It was there and then it was gone, but it's still there for kids. But the diagnosis of depression is, again, it's framed around adults. It involves endorsing certain kinds of feeling states, and the only mention of kids is that instead of weight loss or weight gain, it's some young kids might not make weight milestones, or they might be apathetic, and that's it. Other than that, there's nothing in particular about whether or not kids might show depression in a different way. So we have essentially 2 camps that emerge in the 1980s. There's the McNew and Citrin camp saying that depression in kids is masked, looks different. And then there's a group that says, actually, you can diagnose kids with DSM-3. And then there's another group that says depression is not something that happens in kids. Like kids get sad, but depression is a completely different thing that doesn't happen in kids. That group gets smaller and smaller over time, but for the most part, it became a little bit of a conflict between the 2 different perspectives. And this is explained by Gabrielle Carlson and Dennis Cantwell, both of whom were involved with DSM-3, arguing that actually depression criteria work for kids. And the part of the challenge, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but part of the challenge involves when you say that it works to diagnose, what exactly does that mean? Because asking adults if they're feeling depressed, if they're having trouble with energy, if they feel unmotivated, those things all work. I mean, there's a whole nother conversation about how valid the whole category of depression is to describe things, which is a different conversation, but at least you can ask adults questions about symptoms. It's a little bit more complicated when you start to translate that to kids and what does that mean. And so some of the conversation also involves exactly how we think about talking to kids. So to think about assessment, this question of gathering information from kids to get to DSM criteria. I think one of the things that many people outside psychiatry don't necessarily think about is there are criteria for different illnesses, but how do you know if they're there? And I think a lot of people are kind of caught by surprise at how subjective it is. It's basically whatever somebody says at that particular moment. Again, in adults, that has one set of issues. In a kid, that's a completely different kind of set of issues. Number one, do you ask a child, or do you ask the child's parents, or do you ask the child's teachers, or do you ask all of them? Or as far as I can tell, nobody's writing about asking the child's peers, which would be very interesting these days, considering that they're talking to each other on social media more than they're talking to their parents. But in terms of like who's the best informant, if you will, about what's going on with a kid, how do you deal with the time issue? Those of us who've raised kids know that a 13-year-old's idea of a really long time could be an hour, maybe a week, certainly not anything like reflecting on years of experience. And adults can also struggle with time, but there's some developmental stuff that's appropriate in terms of kind of thinking about time. And then if you have to kind of expand the questions and ask different things, then is that really adhering to the criteria at all? And so there's an ongoing conversation that has not yet been resolved about how to assess. And so the assessment is assessment for the presence of depression. And then it very quickly morphs by the 1980s into assessment of treatment. So in terms of the assessment of depression, there were several different varieties of asking questions. And one was developed by the University of Pennsylvania, the same group that developed cognitive behavior therapy. So Aaron Beck and his group, Maria Kovacs and David Burns. And so the Beck Depression Inventory, which was copyrighted and is currently available for a fee, involves statements about basically I feel, and it's designed to help individual patients assess give their responses to questions, which will give a diagnosis of depression. For kids, what they also copyrighted the form. So I can't show you the whole form because I didn't want to pay for it. These are some of the questions. There are 27 questions, and they're all more or less along this framework. I'm sad once in a while, I'm sad many times, I'm sad all the time. And so they're all like small, medium, large, some of the time, none of the time, all the time kind of questions. And they involve sleep, appetite, mood, but also school performance, peer performance, and self-esteem. And so based on all of this, many of these questions are not in the DSM. Some of them are, some of them are not. And based on this, theoretically, it's possible to come up with a diagnosis of depression. And looking at these scores is one of the ways in which researchers have tracked, again, the presence or absence of depression, but also the effectiveness of treatments, which I'll talk about in a minute. These are all first-person reports, and it's not asking another informant, it's asking the child only. Here's another standard form that has been used for treatment studies. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I just found this really fascinating. So in an effort to try to quantify treatment response, whether it's for psychotherapy or for medications, A number of researchers in child psychiatry have used the CGI, which sounds very, it's got an acronym and everything, and it's got numbers and everything. But what it is a slightly souped up version of what psychiatric researchers were using in the 50s and 60s to assess drug effects. And it starts off with basically saying, how sick is this person on a scale of 1 to 7? And then on a scale of 1 to 7, how much better or worse did they get? And that's it. That's all there is to it. And there are FDA approved some drugs based on CGI scores, which I find kind of breathtaking. So this is like the opposite of the CDI. There's no symptoms. There's no first person report. This is all the clinician and what the clinician thinks is happening. Again, so there are many scales, and this is just a taste of the scales, but they're all different depending on who you ask and what you ask and how you're asking, what time frame, and they all have limitations. They all have problems because everybody's perspective is different. So as child psychiatrists, we're working on trying to figure out whether or not kids were depressed and then what to do about it. There were some conversations about doing therapy and other kinds of interventions. And when cognitive behavior therapy was manualized and exportable, then people started doing some research in that. There had been psychoanalytic research going on for decades. So there have been analysts publishing about particular cases where particular interventions were used. That had been going on for a long time, but nothing that the research folks thought was adequate. So in terms of trying to figure out how to translate what was going on in adult psychiatry to child psychiatry, again, there's some of the structured therapy started to get incorporated, but for a long time, medication didn't seem to be something that was useful. So there were not very many people who wanted to try using psychiatric meds in kids, with a gigantic asterisk around stimulants. So stimulants in kids, that's a whole different conversation, but people were not discussing stimulant use for depression in kids that I've seen. It's possible that was a conversation going on, but there was plenty of business with just disruptive boys. So lots and lots of stimulants, but not much of anything else. And there were quite a number of people who tried in small studies to use tricyclic antidepressants in the late 70s, early 80s for kids who may or may not have been depressed, to try to see if that worked. They seem to work really well in adults. Would they work in kids? And the answer was pretty much a resounding no. They don't work. The only and that's regardless of how you slice it, you assess it. It just, everybody was in agreement, which was kind of impressive. The tricyclics don't work. The only thing that they work well for is bedwetting, which is not surprising because tricyclics cause urinary retention, so it would make sense that they work for bedwetting. But tricyclics didn't work. The monoamine oxidase inhibitors didn't work. Everybody was nervous about drug effects, but all of that changed in 1987 when Prozac came on the market. Fluoxetine was approved by the FDA in 1987, and both Lilly and NIMH got very excited about this and did all kinds of research and outreach having to do with depression, not just about the importance of treatment, but also essentially marketing the idea of depression itself. So there was a campaign, the Depression Awareness Recognition Treatment Campaign, Depression Awareness Recognition Treatment, DART campaign, that started in 1988. Prozac was introduced in 1987. Eli Lilly, maker of Prozac, underwrote the NIMH campaign. And so Prozac was this new thing, relatively quickly got approved for kids. It was exciting because it didn't have some of the major side effects, and there was a lot of potential. People thought that maybe it could work, whatever work meant. So as a result, partly as a result of Prozac, partly as a result of, again, ongoing conversations and ongoing assumptions and in increasing use of DSM criteria, the clinic populations started to shift, and the depression population started to shift such that research trials that started off being mostly boys or majority of boys by the late 1990s started to be much more skewed toward girls. No explanation, no discussion, a lot of hand waving and a lot of assertions about where depression is more common in girls, theoretically. So again, lots of hand waving, and there's no clear trajectory, except that the DSM criteria do seem to select for more populations of girls, which I don't think is that surprising, because I would argue that I have argued that the depression is a category, that symptoms were designed around populations of women in the first place. But the depression studies really started skewing more toward girls, and nobody really knows. And again, there's still a lot of disagreement in the literature. They're starting to have a conversation that we know that depression in women happens twice as often as in men. Some people say that is true for adolescent girls, but pre-puberty, either depression doesn't happen at all or it's equal in boys and girls. I don't think anybody actually knows, again, because this category of depression has not been stable. And even if it were, I'm not sure that it would be possible to clearly nail this down, because there's so much else going on. But you can see this in the re-edition of McNew and Citron's book. So instead of Why Isn't Johnny Crying, it's now Growing Up Sad. And so while the 1996 hardcover edition, the gender of the child is not entirely clear, by 1998, it's definitely a girl. I mean, these days you could question, but in 98, this was a girl, long hair and all. And so it had very much shifted toward an assumption that depression was something that happens more in girls. Okay. So by the beginning of the 21st century, there's a lot more focus on drugs, a lot more conversation about depression in kids, and a lot of this is really just conversation. There's not a whole lot else that's really kind of we're still missing the magic blood test or diagnostic image for depression that still hasn't shown up yet. So there's still just a lot of, like, as far as we know, or studies show or symptoms that there's a lot of fuzziness in the conversation. But things had gotten, by the beginning of the 21st century and the rise of SSRIs, things had gotten to the point where depression was considered common enough that primary care physicians in pediatrics had started to get scolded in the way that primary care physicians in adults had been scolded about failing to detect depression when it was really there. And so there's a lot of push by the 21st century to really think about meds in kids. Drug companies were newly empowered, liberated, depending on how you want to frame it, to start doing more research in kids. In 1997, for reasons that I don't fully understand, the FDA decided that it was a really great idea to let pharmaceutical companies market directly to consumers and to give them incentives to study drugs in kids, including extending their patent life on things. So both of these things increased pharmaceutical investment in drugs in kids. Whether that improved care for anybody is a whole different question. But there's definitely a lot more pharmaceutical company interest in investment in marketing and maybe doing research in meds in kids. So most of the SSRIs got tested in kids by the 21st century. I think only one or two actually got approved. Most of the studies were negative, and so they were not able to get approval from the FDA. It doesn't matter. I mean, as a physician, you can prescribe off-label, and it doesn't matter. But a lot of the SSRIs actually don't have FDA approval for use in kids. But there's still ongoing questions within this question of depression in kids. Again, lots of conversation, but ongoing questions. One that was raised initially that has not been resolved is the assumption, I think, back in the 70s in conversation around depression in kids, was if you treat kids, presumably you'll prevent them from developing depression as adults. And that has not turned out to be the case. And then that question hasn't been asked in a while. So without just kind of quietly went away. But there have been a bunch of really interesting conversations about to what extent it's beneficial from a healthcare point of view, from a health policy point of view, to treat depression in kids. Like, is it worth it? There was one study, the Treatment for Adolescents Depression study, the TADS study. So one of the fun things about 21st century drug trials is they all have fun acronyms. So there's the Katie trial and the TADS trial. Anyway, so the TADS trial raised questions about cost effectiveness. One of the things I want to show with it, this was a table that was published in the TADS trial in the early 2000s, is that they got a little defensive about the numbers, the percentage of girls they had in their study, and they had it was closer to 50-50 in their study, whereas a lot of the trials had a higher percentage of girls. Some of them had a lower percentage, and they discussed it in the paper. It was a little fuzzy about why they thought it was worth mentioning, but it seemed to be that they were addressing a potential criticism of their study, saying that they included so many boys. Like, was that valid to include that many boys? And they said, well, other people did too, so it's probably fine. That again, it had swung so far that including boys in conversations about depression seemed somewhat suspect, at least in anticipation of criticism by these writers. But there was a lot of enthusiasm about meds. Everything, though, came to a screeching halt in 2004 when the FDA issued a black box warning against SSRIs, particularly in kids. So what happened was that the UK, which is much less beholden to the pharmaceutical industry than the United States, researchers noted a significant correlation between use of SSRIs and suicidal thinking, suicidal behaviors, and completed suicides in people who had been given SSRIs. And the UK research was about all people, not just kids. And FDA analysts reluctantly went back and looked at the data and found that there was, in fact, some statistical relationship between increased suicide behaviors, and SSRI prescriptions. So they put a black box warning on. The black box warning was and continues to be enormously controversial in the field. Some people angrily asserted that pharmaceuticals shouldn't be given to any kids, and this is a great example of why. It's all dangerous. Kids shouldn't be getting meds. Other people denounced the FDA warning, saying that more kids were going to die from completed suicides from untreated depression than they would have from side effects to medications. There has not actually been clear evidence one way or another, although some people have tried to claim that the suicide rate in kids spiked right after the FDA warning. I have not been able to find actual data suggesting that. I just a lot of, like, people say, and this happened, but I'm not sure that actually happened. The other thing about the suicide conversation that makes it really, really difficult. Suicide is absolutely an enormously important conversation, and a major concern. Unfortunately, the worries about suicide in kids have become all about adequately treating depression. And the thing is that suicide is much more complicated than untreated depression, so much more complicated. And that's true for adults as well. And so making this all about treating or not depression is just, that does a disservice to the very real, very complex, very broader social conversation about suicide. But that's one of the reasons that why people were raising alarms. In hindsight, some of the more charitable interpretations of the FDA action have been to say that actually what the FDA was saying was that we need to be careful about prescriptions of SSRIs in kids, and that primary care physicians shouldn't be just handing a prescription and saying, come back in 6 months. And so, I think when everything rolls downhill, it's the pediatricians who are getting the brunt of all of this, all of the criticism. But among the things that continue to happen are that the idea of sort of depression and what does it mean for women and what does it mean for men, and therefore what does it mean for kids is not settled. It's still an ongoing conversation. So during the same time period as the FDA black box warning, there was another fun acronym title that studied the STAR-D trial that was a sequence treatment alternatives, something or other, for depression. This was a study only done in adults, but there were important offshoot parts of the study, and this one was an important piece. You may or may not be able to see in the list of authors, but it's Myrna Weissman again, coming back to talk about the effects of treating depression in mothers and the effects on their kids. So this conversation is still happening. There's still lots of conversation about we need to address depression in moms in order to make the kids better. The other thing that was really interesting that happened during the same time period is that NIMH started a Real Men, Real Depression campaign. I found this was going on right around the time I was starting my first book, and this remains like one of the most remarkable things that I've ever seen. It's real men, period, real depression, period. This is like height of like, let's talk about embattled masculinity in the 21st century. And what's particularly interesting about this campaign is that there's a huge list of symptoms of depression in men that are not in the DSM at all, many of which have been discussed in mass depression in kids. And so it's irritability is like number one, acting out, aggression, having somatic symptoms, physical symptoms. So that was another one of the mass depression things. So a lot of so this Real Men, Real Depression is like, you don't have to talk about your feelings. You can like show that you're acting out, and that's as much of a symptom of depression as anything else. And the men they got for this campaign, it was like a firefighter and a policeman, and it was like just fascinating. And these men too can get antidepressants. So with all this marketing, and even with the FDA black box warning, over the 21st century, the number of prescriptions for antidepressants continue to go up as I think is a possible proxy for the diagnoses of depression, significantly more in all females. And here's a breakdown of age groups. The second bar is the 12 and over bar, and in the middle it's males. The far right is females, and so the significantly more prescriptions for girls than for boys, 12 and over, and at all other ages as well. So meds continue to get prescribed. This is not a huge surprise. The pharmaceutical industry has been acting in bad faith with regard to drug trials, especially around depression. This is not exactly breaking news. This slide represents a list of studies done that were part of a meta-analysis in 2017 that found that the depression studies that were done in kids differed depending on whether they were industry sponsored or NIMH sponsored. That's not a big surprise. The study meta-analysis said that actually the therapeutic effects showed up better in the NIMH trials, which is interesting. And they said that's because the studies were done better. But if you look at the names of the people on the left-hand column, it's like all the same people. So Emsley did an NIMH study and a whole bunch of pharmacy reported studies. And the second, let's see, hold on. Fourth column is response assessment. And I had shown you the CGI numbers. CGI was the primary outcome measure. That's just did they get better, or, how much did they get better? That's it. That was the outcome measure. And so these were basically the drug trials as of 2017. It has come to light since then about some bad acting on behalf of at least some of these people. Graham Emsley was involved in the scandal involving paroxetine, which is one of the SSRIs that failed to get FDA approval because it doesn't actually demonstrate significant effects in kids. But the company tried to fudge this by using a different outcome measure, ghostwriting an article, and then shopping it around to child psychiatrists who would then put their names on it, and then get it submitted to a journal. And Graham Emsley was one of the ones who let his name be put on a ghostwritten article. I don't know what to say.
How do you have so many that don't have children in them?
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so thinking about sort of like the so what here. So sociologist of disease Anne-Marie Jutel has pointed out that a diagnosis serves a social function, that if you in an individual doctor patient interaction, a diagnosis gives a provider something to do and like a plan of action, and it gives a patient permission to be sick, accommodation, validation. It does a whole bunch of things. Um, one of the things that Myrna Weissman did with the diagnosis of depression in moms in particular was that she turned the maternal deprivation hypothesis on its head and said that the reason that moms were not doing well as moms is they were depressed. And so what they needed was treatment. And so instead of focusing on their deficits as moms, let's treat them and then they'll be better moms and their kids will be better. And so what the diagnosis of depression has done in kids, certainly in the last decade or so, is that it helps have an external explanation maybe for why kids are struggling. Kids are definitely struggling. Why are they struggling? Maybe it's because depression is super common. And the numbers and the projections have gotten pretty ridiculous in the last 50 years, from kids don't get depressed to as many as 80% of kids will have some form of mental illness by the time they're 18. Those are some of the numbers. It's just mind-boggling. But the thing is, even without a diagnosis, what the idea of depression actually does a lot of work. And one of the things it does is it says that if kids are not productive, maybe it's because they're depressed. Troubles with peers in school, maybe they're depressed. I mean, it has nothing to do with the schools, their home lives, history of trauma, all kinds of socioeconomic difficulties. And what's particularly painful about this is that throughout these conversations about depression in kids, to the extent that child psychiatrists talk about social factors, it's consistent that they're finding a lot more distress that could be diagnosed as depression in kids with particular kinds of backgrounds, in communities of color, in families that are not economically well off. And instead of sort of saying, gee whiz, maybe there's something to this sort of culture, not culture in a culture of poverty sort of way, but in a like, let's take a look at their actual lives. It's, well, they're just more vulnerable to this illness. But the thing that's perhaps even more troubling about the conversations about depression and the numbers of presumed undiagnosed depressed kids out there, and that's been part of the narrative. There are all these kids and they're undiagnosed and they're lurking out there waiting to be discovered, is that basically normal has now been defined as being able to succeed when the deck is stacked against you, when the schools are terrible, when you have a history of trauma, when there's chaos all around, when you can't concentrate on anything because you don't have a clear source of food, when housing is insecure, and that if you can't succeed in all of that, that's normal to be able to succeed. And if you can't, then it must be depression, which is of course an individualized problem rather than a social problem. The only bright spot in all of this is there are some people kind of thinking about this. There's a research team led by Ruth Shim, who's a really fabulous psychiatrist who's talked about the effects of systemic racism in particular, who have pointed out that when we're thinking about things like depression, that we need to not just talk about an individual kid, and not even just an individual kid and individual kid's parents, but think about broadly and historically. And as a historian, I'm very excited about this idea that you have to think intergenerationally, and you have to think about major events having to do with kids. And so they start actually with the conversations about how much we learned from generations of kids following the Holocaust, how much the narratives and how much that trauma extended beyond generations. And so in communities of color, to think about the Tuskegee syphilis study that continues to echo, to think about systemic racism, that these effects continue to ripple through generations. And so again, as a historian, knowing the history is an important part of my clinical assessment of patients, I think this is a really great and important perspective to have. So thank you very much, and I welcome any comments, questions.
Hi, Laura. Laney Ross, it's great to hear
Hi.
you talk. Yeah, I thought that all the studies on the drugs turned out to be all retracted from in the last like 10 or 15 years, particularly the studies from Columbia and Harvard for pediatric depression, in part because of the conflicts of interest and then that weren't disclosed and things of that sort. Is that not true?
Not all of them. There were some that were retracted, but the retraction itself, that process has been ugly.
Well,
There were-
please talk about it.
Yeah, there were some studies that were retracted from the New England Journal, and then the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry retracted some as well, but for the most part, a lot of it is still very much out there. And a lot of the problems have really been kind of lurking in books like Daniel Carlot's Unhinged. Like he writes about that, but the stuff's still out there. Yeah.
Like as a pediatrician, we're told basically that we have no data. We have no idea whether any of these drugs actually work in children, and just acknowledge that, and whether you prescribe or not, in the sense you're prescribing off-label.
So that isn't the party line among child psychiatrists, and it's not what the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry is saying now, and it's not. I mean, the FDA still has approval for Prozac, and I think there's one more. I can't remember off the top of my head. But it's still that's still the party line is treat early, treat aggressively, and monitor. You know, and so the other thing that's particularly, I find as a clinician particularly annoying, is that the whole black box warning around the risk of suicide didn't explain what the issue was. And so the issue that I was taught in medical school, that the issue is once you start treating somebody for depression, then the first thing that comes back is their energy and they get activated, and that's why they kill themselves. And that's not true. That is not true. The problem is that these drugs cause akathisia, which is this really uncomfortable internal restlessness that is impossible to tolerate, that for some people, kids and adults, come with intrusive thoughts of suicide that are completely disconnected from everything else in their lives. And it's so intolerable that people kill themselves to get away from it. And the person who talked about that is David Healy, who's the psychiatrist in the UK who helped to break this story. But that's not what our clinicians are taught. But akathisia is an enormous problem.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really wonderful. The discrepancies in the numbers between girls and boys are massive. And I'm wondering if you could talk about race and if the numbers look the same in terms of Black and brown youth.
That is a great question, and that data is just not there that I've found so far. And the whole question of race and depression is a complicated one. Most of the literature for adults and for kids has like tiny numbers of in race, and they're not broken down by gender. So there's almost nothing about that. And then what makes it especially complicated is that a lot of clinicians in communities of color argue that depression isn't diagnosed enough. And so there are kids who are not being depressed who should be. And there's a particular argument among like incarcerated youth that too many incarcerated youth are not being psychiatrically treated, they're being criminalized. And there's definitely that, but that's more for boys. So it's a great question. I have not found really good answers. And that is a clear gaping hole in the work. Thank you.
Yeah, so really good presentation, really liked it. My question is similar to Kevin's. So the studies that you showed us, like the TADS, as well as the studies in the 50s and the 60s, so is it to assume that it's only focused on white adults and kids, right? And And are there any types of studies during those times that did not mainly focus on white adults and kids? And when the book came out about just depressive mothers or depressed women, was that also mainly focused on white women and their experiences compared to women of color?
Well, that's a great question also. The work by Myrna Weissman and others were focused mostly on middle-class white women. So that was, that's the same constituents who were doing the consciousness raising groups. And the same splits among the poor women and who were working all along, and the important middle-class women, but had different set of challenges. That the initial conversations about depression came about middle-class white women. The conversations about race, I think that it is a gigantic hole in all of the psychiatric literature, and it's pretty much every treatment modality. In fact, I was looking at a paper by Walter Freeman, the father of lobotomy, who I was looking to see if I could find anything about race and lobotomy. And he gathered, I don't know if you had seen this paper he published in the 60s about race and lobotomy. And he said, yeah, a lot of these hospitals had a lot more patients of color, and he didn't use that word, than others. And I don't really know why these patients didn't get better, and it may have had something to do with race, but I don't know. I mean, that was it. And so part of it, of course, was, and this is something that a lot of these studies having to do with treatment and also description are studies of convenience. They're clinical samples. So clinics have always been segregated, not I mean, in the South up until the 70s and 80s by by intention rather than as it happens. But these, the psychiatric hospitals were predominantly white. The private hospitals were predominantly white. So the populations they were looking at were white people. It's not like they were looking and seeing representative samples of the population. I don't know, and this is a part of the conversation that I want to continue to look at, is how those conversations happen with epidemiology, because those, at least in theory, were looking more at populations rather than clinical samples. And there have been some conversations back and forth about Black families are more resilient, kids don't get depressed, and then conversely, the Black kids get more depressed more easily. But the numbers have been too small. But it's a great question. I want to continue to look at it.
Again, thank you. Is there anything to be learned by looking at the difference in prescribing patterns historically for stimulants versus where we ended up with SRIs?
That's a great question. I mean, sort of in general, the way they're sort of opposite. Like the stimulants start off being all boys, and then the number of girls prescribed is catching up. And for adults with depression, it's primarily women, and then maybe men have been catching up. I don't know about. I suspect that the prescribing for kids for antidepressants was already at a time when numbers were starting to go up for everybody, but that's a great question. I know that pharmaceutical companies have been trying to market quiet attention deficit disorder in girls as sort of an equal opportunity prescriber, and how that looks at. The other thing that makes it complicated from an analysis point of view, I mean, it's a great question, and then it's something I can take a look at, is who's prescribing, and so pediatricians do the vast majority of prescribing of pretty much everything. It's child psychiatrists are so minuscule in number that they're not doing a whole lot, and so then we have to kind of put that in the context of everything else that pediatricians are doing, and so I think it's a great question.
Just as a side thing, you failed to mention my favorite on marketing.
What's that?
So if you recall when Eli Lilly came up with seraphim, which was philosophy, but taste
Uh-huh,
for premenstrual disorder disorder, which got them another 2 years.
yeah,
And then they got a pediatric premenstrual dysphoric disorder extension.
did they really?
They did, mind boggling.
Yeah. Eli Lilly is definitely the villain of the story in David Healy's Farmageddon, which I highly recommend. It's very entertaining reading.
Yeah, I think they would say that.
Thank you so much for your talk. So when you mentioned about pediatricians doing the majority of the prescribing, can you talk about the cross-disciplinary conversations between child psychiatrists and pediatricians more? Was there kind of blind faith that treatment was necessary for childhood depression, or was there a lot of questioning between pediatricians and child psychiatrists?
That's also a great question. So for a long time, child psychiatry basically owned conversations about mental illness and care, basically serious mental issues in kids. Somewhere around the 70s and 80s, so right around the time that all of this was happening, the subspecialty of behavioral pediatrics started to emerge to try to own some of that, partly because child psychiatry has never been on the ground that helpful because the numbers are just so small. And that the numbers of professionals in the country is always been infinitesimal. So somewhere along the way between behavioral pediatrics and then pediatricians just sort of generally having a moment, actually also involving the University of Rochester, trying to remember, Robert Haggerty. Yeah. He promoted, so basically as child infectious diseases started to plummet and pediatricians were trying to figure out what to do with themselves because they weren't having to treat as much infectious disease. At that moment where everybody thought infectious disease was dead. Yeah. Whoops. That he argued for the new morbidity that was basically mental issues in kids, and that pediatricians should step up and do something about that. So between Haggerty's trying to move toward behavioral issues, behavioral pediatrics, and then the American Academy of American Academy of Pediatrics starting to do its own thing. The pediatrics has really kind of taken an independent stance and not wanted to take direction from child psychiatrists. So there's a lot of stuff in the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry archives that's a conflict between the AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics, and the child psychiatry group. And the AAP keeps saying, yeah, we're going to just do our own thing and we don't really care what you say. And so they've done a lot of depression outreach, and I think that they have been less nuanced about what needs to happen and more like, we've got this thing, we want to treat it, let's do screening tests in our waiting rooms and get these kids on meds. That's a grossly simplified version, and there's definitely more to the story, but also a great question.
I'll see if I can inject myself. All right, so I did a lot. You're not a pediatrician. How do you know? And then, but what do I do when I see the individual kids who's suffering in front of me? These are the two questions I always get, and I assume you also get those. Because you're an adult today, right?
Right, but the reason I got involved in this project was I was seeing a ton of kids in the ER. I mean, I'm not working in the ER anymore right now, but that was huge. That was like,
this is not criticism.
yeah.
So when you get these questions, how do you respond, or how do you have a productive conversation with your peers who perhaps take these, this space and they do want to take a child who doesn't really suffering or not going to solve this school issues or whatever, and what do they do? I feel like it's never going to find response, but that's probably what you get often is like, what should I do with kids? So how do you have this conversation?
Well, part of it is what I've tried to do both in practice when I'm having to see kids or when I'm supervising is to start off with saying we have to validate the concern, and because that is what a lot of this is coming from is people feeling like they need a diagnosis to be validated instead of just saying, yeah, this is really hard and yeah, this is overwhelming. Part of the problem that we all deal with if we're seeing patients and trying to practice medicine is people want the pills to solve the problems. I mean, there's a great New Yorker cartoon that I always showed to the residents, and it's not even really all that funny. It's a woman sitting in front of a TV and watching TV and the caption says, ask a doctor if taking a pill to solve all your problems is right for you. I mean, that's always, we always want that. And nobody wants to hear the drugs have side effects, that it's not going to solve the problems, it might add more. And then on the flip side, you know, some people who maybe need a little extra help don't necessarily want to take it. And so, you know, the concept of what works is such a fraught one. And there's been so much argument about whether or not antidepressants work. And depending on who you talk to, they either don't work at all or they work perfectly. But there's definitely something to a non-specific effect, you know, the old placebo effect, that having some benefit of the transaction on an individual basis may do something, as long as you set expectations appropriately. So that's kind of how I've kind of hedged my bet, that on a social level, we need to not be promising that pills can solve problems. On an individual level, if we need to do like a short-term prescription to get somebody over a hump, that's how and honestly, that's how I'm mostly approaching depression in adults, is, you know, let's kind of get you over this particular crisis, and yeah, you need a lot of help, and let's not give more money to the pharmaceutical company.
Thank you for this wonderful topic. I don't know if you heard recently about women in microdosing and childbearing age or taking care of children, and if you can comment about that phenomenon.
This is the pregnant women taking microdoses, or
Yeah, both. You know, moms take, you know, using psychedelics to go through their day. Have you? It was on NPR the other day, like you know, yeah, you know, they're using shrooms and small doses to get through their day. So, you know, I get the point that, you know, I think trying to make it human nature to wanting something to solve their problem, you know, and it's really hard when you're in the trenches to kind of balance that out, you know, and I agree with you, when you have a child suffering, you know, like I saw the other day, a 6-year-old kid that wanted to commit suicide.
The thing is that doesn't,
Yeah.
it means something different. And I think adults freak out when a kid says something scary, and, you know, they can, you know, you have to start thinking developmentally at some point. It doesn't mean you just blow it off, but it also doesn't mean that it's the same thing as, you know, a 45-year-old intoxicated man holding a loaded gun to his head. It's a little bit of a different phenomenon. And so I think that's part of some of the sort of common sense that we've lost. On the psychedelics, you know, as a historian, it's so hard to hear people getting super excited about psychedelics, because there's just so much rich history in our field of psychedelics gone wrong, and all the terrible things that we've done and just not learned from, that it's painful. And the thing that I come back to is that in the 60s, I think it's in the 60s, maybe it's around 68, 69, the American Academy of Neuropsychopharmacology, which is like the uber elite, very closely guarded, invitation only psychiatry group, researchers only, published this fascinating book called Psychiatry in the Year 2000, where they were projecting what they thought the psychiatry was going to be. And these are the researchers who were doing cutting edge psychopharm in the late 60s. And so they're letting their imaginations run wild based on what they think is tenable in the science of the future. And they had a whole chapter in that book about the wonders of LSD, that LSD was going to do everything. It was going to literally solve world hunger. It was going to treat alcoholism, and it was going to have all these amazing effects. And like 2 years later, LSD was banned in the United States, and all these secret experiments that the CIA was doing with it came to light. And so it's just hard to not roll my eyes and just say, just no. I mean, So I confess, I can't be unbiased when I'm hearing about some of this other stuff. The same thing is also true with cannabis. I mean, people are raving about the effects, the wonderful effects of cannabis, that it's natural, that it doesn't involve pharmaceutical marketing. And so therefore, if the pharmaceutical company's not involved and they're evil, then it must be fine. And I don't know. Maybe we need to go back to creating healthy neighborhoods, something along those lines. But they're important, really, really challenging questions.
I guess we're out of time. We have a couple snacks that are there. We can probably, we have to ask some more questions if
Yeah.
needed. But, well, thank you again, Dr. Lauren, for trying to do this fabulous talk. We're the Corner Society. We have, I want to acknowledge the Department of Psychiatry at Southern Law at the beginning, who co-sponsored your visit. So, and thank you to the psychiatrists who joined us today. Also, Corner Society is located within the Department of Health, Humanity, and Bioethics. To acknowledge that our relationship, and the new chair who is here, Dr. Lady Ross. Also, our next talk is April 19th. I'm going to read out the title. You can take a little flyer on the way out. When the community has a place at the table, community control, activism, and American medicine in the 1960s and 70s. It's Professor Mary Rogers, who's coming up from Yale. I think it's going to be a fabulous talk, and I'm excited. That will be the last one in our very rich series. People will be back in fall. So thank you again, first one, thank you to the people here at the Pacific Kennedy, and by that we need one person who says everything. And thank you to my sister and Bob Riley, who worked together to do this and power public next before the meeting. Thank you.
You know, there's a book on